Everything in the life of 14-year-old Amara changed in an instant. Two officers, without a single piece of evidence, dragged her from the cafeteria table at school, accusing her of stealing a phone. A crowd of her peers froze, watching the scene unfold, but the officers had no idea that she was the daughter of the governor himself, a man who would never let such injustice go unanswered. When the truth came out, the consequences shocked everyone who considered themselves untouchable. What happened next would stun even the most experienced. But let's go back to the beginning. Amara Carter, a 14-year-old high school student, was the daughter of recently elected state governor Gregory Carter. Despite her family's high status, Amara preferred to stay in the shadows. For her, school was a place where she could feel like a regular girl without attracting unnecessary attention. She was smart and hardworking, but tried not to stand out among her peers. Her father often told her that it's important to remain humble, even when holding a high position, and Amara followed this rule. However, that day changed everything. During lunch, she was surrounded by two school officers. There was a note of threat in their voices when they asked her to step away from the table. "Amara Carter?" one of them said sharply. "Did you take Jessica Taylor's phone?" Amara looked up, surprised by such an accusation. She had no idea what they were talking about. At that moment, all the conversations around her stopped, and hundreds of eyes were focused on her. Her friends froze, not understanding what was happening. Jessica's phone, a popular girl from a parallel class, had disappeared during break, and for some reason, suspicion immediately fell on Amara. She felt fear and confusion tightening inside her. She had heard of similar incidents involving other black students, but never imagined it could happen to her. The officers didn't offer any explanation, only sternly demanded that she follow them. It wasn't an invitation, it was an order. "I didn't take anything," Amara said calmly, trying to sound confident, but her voice trembled with fear. However, her words seemed to dissolve into the air. Without acknowledging her response, the officers grabbed her elbow and led her through the cafeteria. The entire hall fell silent, watching as Amara walked by. The stares of her classmates burned into her back. Many were already pulling out their phones, ready to record the scene, knowing it would become a hot topic on social media. As she was led to the security office, Amara felt her world turn upside down. Her heart pounded, and she was bewildered. Why had they chosen her? Why hadn't they checked others? But deep down, she knew the answer. This wasn't the first time she'd faced moments like this. Moments where her skin color was the primary evidence. When Amara was brought to the security office, she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. The office was cold and impersonal, with old chairs and peeling walls. She sat on one of the chairs opposite two officers, who began interrogating her without any courtesy. This wasn't a typical school investigation. The atmosphere resembled a police station, where suspects weren't treated gently. "You were in the area where Jessica's phone disappeared," one officer began sharply. "The cameras caught you near her belongings." Amara felt her breathing quicken. The cameras might have shown her nearby, but she couldn't believe that was enough to accuse her of theft. "I didn't take her phone," she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady, though internally, she was screaming with indignation. The officers exchanged glances as if her words meant nothing. One of them continued to press her. "We know you were close. Just tell the truth, and it'll make things easier for you." Amara felt her anger begin to boil beneath the layer of fear. Make things easier? Why weren't they listening to her? Why didn't anyone want to find out the truth? It seemed they were more interested in the accusation than justice. They had already decided she was guilty and weren't planning to hear her defense. "Why aren't you checking anyone else?" Amara asked, still holding back but with a firmer voice. "You haven't even talked to the other students. Why me?" The officers were silent for a few seconds. Then one of them smirked. "We saw you were close by. This has nothing to do with who you are or the color of your skin." Those words stung especially sharply. They reminded her of all the times people claimed not to see color, even though their actions suggested otherwise. She knew that the accusations were likely based not on facts, but on stereotypes. Her father had always warned her that the world would place more obstacles in her way simply because of who she was born. She clenched her fists under the table, feeling a sense of helplessness. She was a child being pressured by adults armed with authority and stereotypes, and she couldn't just walk away from this situation. "You chose me because I'm different," she said quietly but confidently. These words hung in the air. The officers hesitated for a moment. Then one of them, irritated by her persistence, harshly ordered her to sit quietly while they checked the cameras and continued their investigation. Amara sat in the cold room, feeling her world collapsing inside. She couldn't call her father because she didn't want to use his name to avoid punishment. She wanted to be judged for who she was, not as the governor's daughter. But now she realized that sometimes circumstances force you to fight for justice by any means necessary. Amara had been sitting in the security office for nearly an hour. She no longer felt anxious. Anger and frustration had taken its place. The officers treated her like a criminal, though there was no evidence of her guilt. They hadn't even bothered to consider other possible suspects. It seemed that their choice had been based solely on the fact that Amara differed from most of the students by her skin color. Finally, when the door opened, Principal Mrs. Vanders entered the room, accompanied by the officers. Their faces expressed a mixture of confusion and tension. "Amara," Mrs. Vanders began, looking at her restrainedly, "we need to talk to you. We reviewed the cameras and found the real phone." Amara straightened up in her chair, tense, waiting for explanations. "Jessica's phone was found in another student's bag," the principal continued. "It was Sarah Davis." Amara flinched in surprise. Sarah, one of the top students in their class, had always had a reputation as a model and responsible girl. She came from a family respected in the school and community. No one would have thought she could steal something. Sarah admitted she accidentally took the phone, thinking it was hers. Mrs. Vanders added coldly, clearly trying to smooth over the situation. But Amara knew the situation wasn't just a mistake. Why had she been accused right away, and Sarah hadn't even been considered? The answer was obvious. Amara was suspected not because of facts, but because of her skin color. And that's it? Amara looked directly at the principal, not hiding her indignation. "You're just going to call this a mistake?" The principal hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. The officers remained silent, as if nothing serious had happened. Amara realized that she had been falsely accused, and no one intended to apologize. "You can return to class," Mrs. Vanders said dryly, as if the incident meant nothing. But for Amara, this was more than just an accusation. She realized that she was considered guilty, not because of something she had done, but simply because of who she was. The world had shown its unfairness, and now she could no longer close her eyes to it. Back in class, Amara couldn't focus on her lessons. Inside, she simmered with a mixture of anger and despair. She knew that despite all the facts, many students continued to believe she was guilty. Rumors spread, and even the video of her being escorted by officers was already circulating on social media. In the eyes of many, she was guilty simply because her skin color made her suspicious. After school, she went home feeling dejected. Her father, Gregory Carter, always met her after work, despite his high office as governor. Upon seeing his daughter, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. "What happened, Amara?" he asked when she walked into the living room. Amara, unable to hold back any longer, told him everything. How she had been unjustly accused of theft, how she had been humiliated in front of her classmates, and how Sarah, the real culprit, had been protected because of her reputation. Her voice trembled as she spoke about how unfairly she had been judged simply because of her appearance. Governor Carter listened in silence, and with each word, his face became more serious. He was a man of principles and had always fought for justice, but hearing that his daughter had suffered from systemic racism enraged him. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly when Amara finished her story. "You shouldn't have had to go through this. They have no right to treat you this way." Gregory Carter had always been a man of action. He understood that incidents like this couldn't be left unpunished, especially when they involved his own daughter. He immediately took out his phone and began contacting lawyers and school representatives. He knew that this situation not only affected his family, but was a symbol of a broader problem that black children across the state faced. "We'll take care of this," he told Amara after several calls. "I want them to not only apologize, but also publicly acknowledge their mistake. This must not happen again to you or anyone else." Amara listened to her father intently, feeling her anger gradually giving way to determination. She realized that they couldn't allow the system to break them. Gregory Carter wasn't just a governor. He was a man who always fought for justice, and now he was ready to do everything possible to protect his daughter and seek the truth. "Tomorrow, we'll hold a press conference," he continued. "We'll tell everyone what happened, and I'll do everything in my power to ensure that this situation doesn't go unnoticed." Amara felt that with each of her father's words, her inner state was changing. She was no longer a victim. Now she had support, and together with her father, they were ready to fight for justice. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Carter household was tense. Governor Gregory Carter was in his office, preparing for the press conference he had organized specifically to publicly discuss the incident involving his daughter. For Amara, this was a pivotal moment. For the first time, she felt that their family's position could work to her advantage, not for privileges, but for defending rights and fighting systemic injustice. "Are you ready?" her father asked when she approached his office. Amara nodded. She knew this press conference wasn't just about her. It was about every black child who had faced injustice due to racial prejudice. When they arrived at the venue for the press conference, a crowd of journalists, cameras, and microphones had gathered in front of the building. For Amara, this was a new experience, being in the spotlight not as the governor's daughter, but as someone who had been wronged by injustice. She understood that at stake was not only her reputation, but also the opportunity to change the situation for many others. Gregory Carter was the first to step up to the podium. He was strict and composed, but his voice revealed deep emotional involvement. He briefly outlined the facts of the case without naming students, but he emphasized the seriousness of what had happened to his daughter. He spoke about the systemic problem that permeates schools, law enforcement, and public institutions. "My daughter was accused of a crime simply because someone decided she was suspicious based on the color of her skin," he said firmly. "And this is unacceptable. We cannot allow situations like this to happen again. We must fight systemic discrimination at all levels, from schools to legal institutions." After his words, it was Amara's turn to speak. Her heart pounded, but she took a deep breath and approached the microphone. She told her story, trying to be clear and precise. She didn't want to evoke pity. She wanted people to understand how deeply racism was rooted even in places where children should feel safe. "I just wanted to be an ordinary student," Amara began. "But instead I was immediately suspected simply because I was different. That's not fair. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. We all deserve to be treated equally, regardless of who we are or where we come from." Her words were simple, but they carried strength. She wasn't just speaking for herself, but for those whose voices were often unheard. When the press conference ended, journalists asked questions, and it was clear that the story had resonated with the public. It was no longer just about one student. It had become a symbol of the broader struggle for justice and equality. Meanwhile, changes began in the school. Principal Mrs. Vanders, along with the officers involved in the incident, faced public pressure. The school administration issued a public apology to Amara and promised to conduct a series of training programs for staff to ensure such situations would not happen again. Sarah Davis, who had avoided contact with Amara all this time, finally approached her in the schoolyard after classes. She looked embarrassed and scared. It was clear that she was worried about her reputation and the consequences for herself. Sarah began, stammering. "I want to apologize. I know I did wrong. I was just afraid to admit it." Amara looked at her silently. Inside, she wrestled with her emotions. She could have exploded and expressed all her hurt and anger, but she also understood that this situation went far beyond their personal conflict. "Apologize not just to me," Amara said calmly. Apologize for letting the system protect you at the expense of others. Sarah didn't know what to say and left, leaving Amara alone with her thoughts. But for Amara, this moment was another small victory. She wasn't just defending herself, but also teaching a lesson to someone who had been part of that injustice. After the press conference, Amara's life began to return to normal, but the aftermath of the incident lingered for a long time. The school administration issued formal apologies, and the story gained wide public attention. Thanks to the actions of her father, Governor Gregory Carter, bias reduction programs were initiated in schools across the state. But Amara couldn't just forget everything that had happened. It was important to her that those who unjustly accused her faced consequences. The school officers who had rudely accused Amara without proper investigation faced serious repercussions. After public pressure and the governor's intervention, both officers were temporarily suspended. They were required to undergo mandatory training on bias and discrimination. This was an important decision, showing that such actions would not go unpunished. Amara knew that this couldn't fully repair the damage done to her and other black students, but it was a meaningful step. These officers could no longer simply turn a blind eye to their actions and continue their work as before. The school also made changes to its policy. Now, in any situation involving accusations of theft or other incidents, a full and impartial investigation was required before any judgments were made. Amara felt that her story had helped not only her, but also many other students who could have been victims of the same injustice. Sarah Davis, realizing the seriousness of her actions, began to change. She approached Amara with sincere apologies and acknowledged that her fear of exposure shouldn't have overshadowed her responsibility. It wasn't so much reconciliation as it was a necessary step toward rethinking her behavior and beliefs. For Amara, this moment marked a point of growth. She realized that her fight didn't end with public apologies or measures against the officers. Her voice had become stronger, and her understanding of injustice had deepened. Now she knew that she could and should fight for truth and justice, not only for herself, but also for others. Now, when Amara looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not just a student, but someone who had gone through injustice and managed to make a difference.